friends and viewers, I have a very special guest for you today, Stephen Eric Bronner. My guest today, he is a political scientist and philosopher, board of governors, professor of political science at Rutgers University, United States, and he is also director of global relations for the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights, co-director of International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue. Mr. Bronner has published over 25 books and more than 200 journal articles. Dr. Bronner has been engaged in various projects with the aim of helping resolve conflicts and bettering understanding between nations. Working as a chair of the executive committee with United States Academics for Peace and as an advisor for Consciousness International, has been a member of various delegations that has visited hotspots in the Middle East and elsewhere. Mr. Bronner also visited Ukraine few weeks or maybe few months. I don't remember now. Ukraine.
December, yeah.
Yeah, and it was very helpful for us visit also. Hello, Stephen. It's a great pleasure for me to meet you today.
The pleasure is mine.
Thank you. And of course, today we'll talk about the peace finding and conflict resolution, and we'll talk about the American policy, external, internal American policy, because you are extremely professional and experienced in it. The first question, Stephen, what is going on in the United States in general today? How acute are the issues of rising consumer goods prices and internal political divisions in society? The latest decision on the possibility of a ban of abortion, the so-called Democratic and Republican states, and the active migration of the population between them. What is happening? Is the world really dealing with two Americans now, ultra-liberal and ultra-conservative, or is this a big exaggeration?
Nothing like discussing the entire world in 5 minutes. But let me start this way. The split in the United States is real. And I think the way to think about it for your audience is that this split between, shall we say, liberal / democratic socialist on one side and really neo-fascists on the other, because the moderate Republican Party, if not gone, is certainly marginalized. In other words, the Republican Party has essentially been taken over by the far right. I don't think there's any question about that. And you can see this, I think, in two different ways. First of all, the idea that there is a radical right in the United States. This is very old. This goes back to virtually the beginning of the country. And you can see over time different movements, the Ku Klux Klan, the temperance movement, the America First movement of the 1930s, which opposed American entry into any war with the Nazis, McCarthyism, which was an internal repression of dissent in the United States, and then coming up more to the present, the Southern assault on attempts to integrate, and the kind of right-wing developments that occurred under President Reagan and then, of course, President Bush. Now, and the Tea Party, of course, which served as the basis, really the basis in 2008 for what we have today. The way I think to think about this is that what was part of civil society in the United States, going back 150 years, has now entered the political institutional mainstream. In other words, it's no longer just something we ignore or that exists better, that this kind of radical right neo-fascism is not simply something that exists beneath the surface of moderate politics or moderate conflicts in the political realm, but it is. But now it has become the conflict in the political realm. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you ask about abortion and obviously the right-wing drift in the Supreme Court. I think for our purposes, it's simpler to look at this another way. The attack on abortion, the incredible shift in wealth to the upper, not 1%, but 0.1%, the attack on voting, which is probably the most serious issue on the table, through a number of institutional mechanisms, the idea of one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, is being eroded. All of this put together, the attack on, shall we say, the welfare state as we know it, the retraction of rights, the retraction of voting, and the retraction of personal liberties is all bound together in one general attack on the welfare state or on the liberal welfare state. That is to say, liberal political and cultural policies on the one hand, let's say social democratic redistributive policies in the economic realm. All of this is one project carried on by the Republicans who are in lockstep with one another still, in spite of the hearings about the January 6th insurrection that has taken place. The one thing that I think your audience might be interested in from the United States is a strange situation in which there's 50-50 in the Senate to pass legislation. And this would be okay if it just remained 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans, and then the vice president would vote on legislation. The vice president is, of course, a Democrat, Kamala Harris. But the vice president only votes if there's a tie, vote. So what this means is that one senator or two senators can have incredible power. And that's exactly what's happened. And they are Democrats who have the power. And that is Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, a small, very economically underdeveloped state, which is basically conservative. And Arizona's senator, Senator Simstra, who is representing perhaps, she's a Democrat, but she represents perhaps the most conservative state in the country, arguably. And these two senators are holding up climate legislation, an extraordinary domestic spending bill to change the whole, to impact the whole infrastructure of the United States, and virtually every progressive piece of legislation that President Biden is putting forward. And these two senators are what we used to call, and I don't know why, but we used to call blue dog Democrats. This is usually one thinks of the Republicans and the Democrats.
And why you call?
I have no idea why it's called that.
Okay.
But this goes back a long ways, and it signifies conservative Democrats. And under present circumstances, these conservative Democrats, these two, have incredible power. The entire world is, if you think about this in terms of climate change, is hanging on these two senators who, let me put it this way, are, as we say in English, not the sharpest tacks in the box. Mm-hmm. In other words, they are very politically dogmatic. They're small-minded, and they are also supported, especially Joe Manchin, by coal interests in West Virginia, some of which he owns, his family owns, and that is basically the situation domestically.
So this thin political balance makes United States policy unpredictable.
Yeah. In a certain way, that's true, except on Ukraine, which is, of course, what you're concerned about, and what your audience is probably most concerned about. The situation is like this. Basically, there's basically a consensus on helping Ukraine. We can get to that in a minute, except for some radical factions of the Republican Party, especially those figures like Tucker Carlson, the famous commentator on Fox News, and a few others like that on one side, and a smaller ultra-left in the United States, which sees NATO as the great threat to world peace. But they are not the groups that I think we have to concern ourselves with. I think the real issue involves the consensus to support Ukraine, which is now slowly beginning to erode.
These two groups, are they pro-Russian groups, or they just use Ukrainian policy of Biden to attack the Democrats on election?
You mean the far
yes,
extreme?
I mean that groups which are opposite of helping Ukraine.
Oh yeah, they are. I think, right, from the left, the far left has always had a problem explaining circumstances in which the United States is not a problem. Yeah, this is, I think, it goes back goes back to the Vietnam War, in the sentiments of the Vietnam War, but these groups, even a journal, a well-respected journal like The Nation, has been basically pro-Russian. I don't think there's any question about that. But whether this is simply that they are pro-Russian or anti-American or anti-NATO that doesn't really matter that much. The objective circumstance is the same. The objective outcome is the same, and that's probably true for the far right as well. Yeah. What bothers me the most, or what I and some of my friends are most concerned about, is the a kind of consensual propaganda that is, how should I say, blurring the need for a genuine strategy, NATO strategy, towards the war. And I guess I would put it this way. A lot of people say the issue is one of appeasement. Yeah. So unless we thoroughly support Ukraine, basically Putin will be free to invade all of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Now, I think this is a very misguided standpoint. They've paid too high a price, I think, to simply take the next step. Taking the next Moldova and states. And if you also, though, that isn't discussed. Here are the alternatives. I see. If one's going, oh, I'm sorry, that out, or you have something you want to say? One thing is we can keep going as we're going. The United States, as you know, has just given another $84 billion to Ukraine. Okay, that's, but this can't go on forever. The American public is not good at making sacrifices for other nations. And the fact of the matter is, for better or worse, Ukraine is just not that important to the bulk of American voters. They're concerned about gas prices, they're concerned about inflation, they're concerned about immediate economic issues, which is usually the case in the United States. So to simply count on this money going, that keeps going in an endless stream, this could put you in a very difficult situation. And it also winds up in a situation which is also somewhat ethically suspect. It's like, we're paying the money so that you and the Russians fight and your land gets destroyed. I mean, America isn't sacrificing anything in terms of anything beyond money. You are sacrificing your whole country. Number two, troops on the ground. If one really wants to talk about appeasement, the next step beyond the money and the sanctions and so on is the West willing to send troops? And this to me is incomprehensible. I think any NATO state which decides to send troops, their government will fall. So that's out. The third step is sort of reinforce Ukraine with nuclear weapons. I don't think anybody wants to do that either.
Except Ukrainians.
So, except Ukraine, yeah, that's right. Which I think is a very short-sighted attitude.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a relative who, after 9/11, we were talking about what to do. He said, if it were up to me, I would level, that is to say, bomb the entire Middle East. This is easy to say, but nobody really wants to do that.
Of course.
I mean, right? So really, I think there is at the moment a real crisis of strategy. And the need for developing a some kind of negotiating position, even if it's only speculative, is crucial, because you're going to have a different response if Russia wins the war, if Ukraine wins the war, or if there's a stalemate. You're going to respond in different ways, and one has to think through the different responses to those three alternatives, instead of simply saying, well, let's avoid appeasement, which doesn't go anywhere. That's my view, anyway.
How do you think, what are the main reasons for Russian invasion to Ukraine, and what are the real goals of the parties in this conflict? Russian Federation, United States, NATO, and European Union. You said very important thing for me, that nobody is ready to prepare today's real strategy and real price strategy, because it looks like every party in this conflict is willing to win. And is going to win, but not going to negotiate. It looks like every party is absolutely sure that they are winning in this war. And it's dangerous, it's a great dangerous, and it's very important to understand what are the main goals of each party, and what is Russia is wanted in this conflict.
Right, somebody just said, I forgot who, but somebody just said that this is a bit of territory, which sounds pretty good. What are Russia's goals? You probably know this better than I do. With Russian ambitions, you and your friends know this better than I do. My sense is this, in sort of offering Ukraine to tentatively join NATO, and even to join the EU, as we say in English, NATO put the bear, Russia. Now, that doesn't, of course, justify Putin invading, but I think there is a here that Putin has been back Peter the Great. That is to say, warm water ports, access to warm water ports, setting up a buffer, what we would call a buffer, against invasion from the West, and reestablishing itself as the dominant country in the region, which would mean, in a certain way, taking back some of the states that that it feels belong, territories that it feels belongs to it. Crimea is a case in point, right? Russia, just for better or worse, Russia feels that that Crimea is part of its territory. And I think a case can be made for that. The same can be said for Donetsk and Luhansk, as you know. I mean, my view, I could be wrong on this. I don't think that Russia would simply completely Russianize Ukraine, even if it won. I think what it would want to do is neutralize it. But I really could be wrong on that. I'm not sure. One thing that is sure is that Russia wants to see itself, and Putin wants to see itself, see Russia as a revitalized nation and a genuine great power that can compete with, let's call it NATO and conflict, is in international terms. We have NATO, which is an alliance of Western states that goes back to after World War II. It was basically useless. It had president was invigorated sense of purpose, provided with a new sense of purpose, and unify states that were really going their own direction, and they had different views towards the European Union and, of course, to NATO. Now you can speak of a certain solidarity with it. This is the next article I want to write, is what I would call a creation of a new authoritarian axis. Not some axis of evil, but an authoritarian axis. What if Putin proceeded in the following way? China is already supportive of Putin. Various Latin American states are all these states have in common. All of them have in common that they're basically authoritarian states. Some more authoritarian, some slightly less authoritarian. But they certainly oppose the, shall we say, the Republican vision of the West, the liberal Republican vision of the West. And I can see that a new Cold War, and maybe not even so cold, but also hot war, can develop between NATO and this new authoritarian axis. And I think that's something worth thinking about. So aside from strategies for Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia, I think Ukraine or the NATO and the United States and Ukraine have to begin thinking about how to deal with this new authoritarian axis, because it can be very, very powerful. Does that make sense?
I think so. And during our talk, I refound one of your last article, the better part of Valour peace for Ukraine. And there is a very important passage for me, and I want that you make this pattern wider. And you said that to be clear. One second. You said you talked a lot about your model of peace building in Ukraine. We'll talk about it later in this interview. But you said very important thing about Ukrainian sacrifice, and Ukraine self-defense, you said, against Russian invasion was no mistake. But there is a point when Valour turns into senseless sacrifice. What do you mean?
This is an idea that I think, or at least the way I look at it, Valour is an extraordinary thing. The Ukrainian people have shown tremendous valor and tremendous bravery. And there was a good reason why they did it. But what happens if that sense of sacrifice? Let me give two examples before we do Ukraine. In 1937 in Spain, as you know, in the 30s, there was a civil war between fascism, Franco, and let's call it for the moment, anti-fascist forces. Among these anti-fascist forces were, shall we say, Trotskyist anarchists on one side and communists on the other. And in 1937, there was a civil war within the civil war between communists and, let's call it, anti-communist elements of the republic. And this basically destroyed the possibility for victory, you know? Now, so that was 1937. By 1937, late 1937, everybody knew that Franco would win. But the peace treaty wasn't signed until 1939. Now, what about those 2 years in between? Stalin sent out communists to fight. A lot of people died. And that's, you know, that's great for their valor. But was that a legitimate thing to do? Then in Vietnam, this is at least what interested me. You all know our former Secretary of State, John Kerry. John Kerry became famous because he was in the military, and he spoke before, I think this was 1969, 1970, I forgot. He spoke before a congressional hearing that was publicized. And he said, who is going, because it was clear the United States was going to lose the war, who is going to be the person who tells the last man in Vietnam that he has to die for this cause that is lost? It's a good question, because as you know, the Vietnam War went on into the 70s, early 70s. Now you have Ukraine. And you have,
but we have another examples. Let me remind you, Winter War, Soviet-Finnish war.
Ask. I mean, you know better than I.
When the Finnish military
sometimes
has no chances to win, but they fighting because they win the time for his independence, for their independence, for their sovereignty, and they win the time when Stalin understood that it's impossible to occupy all the Finland. And maybe Ukraine is the same position. We are trying to win the time before the Putin will understand that there is no chance to occupy all the Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly see that as a possibility, and I don't mean for me from the outside to say to Ukraine, look, you're going to lose the war. Yeah, I don't mean to say that, but I do say this is something you have to take seriously, that you might be losing the war. Yeah, and if you are, unfortunately, and if that's the case, if you come to that conclusion, and I'm not talking about Zelensky, I'm talking about people like yourself, people out of power, everyday citizens who have to pay the price. You have to ask if the price is still worth it. It's unavoidable. And I don't think it's sounding traitorous to the Ukrainian cause to say that. Your country is basically, I mean, from the outside, for someone who doesn't have, as we say, a dog in the race, someone who's from the outside looking at you, right? Here's I think what they would see. If somebody came from Mars and looked at this struggle, they would say, okay, the United States and NATO are supporting you to fight. They're not fighting, you're fighting. It's your country that's being destroyed, not our country. And not only that, so long as this conflict goes on, this basically helps the United States because it weakens the Soviet, it weakens Russia. Sorry about that.
Not only United States, but also China with the time,
and China,
India, and Turkey. Many different countries are trying to catch the fish in this situation.
To catch the fish, yes. And so, I mean, this is in a certain way an incredibly hypocritical situation in which we are saying to you, because we're sending over this money that benefits us in a way, or the United States, we're saying, as we used to say in the schoolyard, when we were little children, we used to say, let's you and him fight. In other words, I'm not fighting, but you and another kid in the schoolyard should fight because I like to watch it.
That is why United States is outside of peace negotiation process, right? Am I right? Why United States all the time, starting from 2014, from Donbass war, United States outside of peace dialogue, Turkey, German, France, even Indonesia and Saudi Arabia trying to do something.
Yeah, and I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump. I hate Trump, but right. But I have to say, one thing that he did was this Abrahamic Accord with the Arab states. I mean, which clearly furthers the cause of peace. I don't think there's any doubt about it. For the Palestinians, it's not great, but the Palestinians aren't the world, right? To sort of try and prevent war between Israel and the broader Arab community, that's far more important in my view. And here, it seems to me that many Western leaders have invested their reputations in Ukraine fighting the Russians. And I think we have to get out of that. We have to be willing to entertain the possibility that Ukraine will lose. And let me even put it differently. As political people, you never think about what's the best. You shouldn't simply think about what's the best outcome. You have to think about what's the worst outcome and act to prevent that, if that makes sense. And for this reason, I think it's up to, this doesn't sound very good, but it's up to Ukraine to make the genuine effort at negotiation, simply because Russia's stronger. This is the same thing as the Palestinians in Israel.
But,
I
but
support
Ukrainian elites and Ukrainian society don't believe that we can lose this war. All this is the bigger part of society, and all the elites, they're sure that we are winning this war, and the possible future in which we are losing this war, it's traitors dialogue. It's like something anti-state dialogue.
That is what we had in Vietnam. I remember the slogan was, if you were critical of the United States, the slogan was, America, love it or leave it. And that is just not, it's not fair.
Something with internet, we are back. And okay, let's start with my question. I think it should be better. And in this situation, when nobody knows the future and nobody knows how this war will be finished, and what kind of peace settlement should be realized, should be developed for Ukraine. How do you think? Yeah, I know you wrote very good articles on this topic.
First, I mean, your questions are really right on target. First, of course, it's true, nobody knows. But part of being a political person means you have to gamble. What's the most likely outcome, and proceed that way. In other words, you have to cover all your bases, have different scenarios for different outcomes, but you also have to decide what's the most likely outcome, and proceed that way. And I think that's not what people are doing. People are just reacting emotionally to this. The second part is what would be in the, did I get that right? What would be in the peace proposal? Is that what you asked? Okay, I can't, obviously lay out point by point what it is because it's very complicated. But it seems to me that there's some basic things which are clear. Humanitarian corridors have to be guaranteed. That, I think, is crucial. How do you rebuild Ukraine? Let's say Ukraine wins, clear cut. Your country is completely destroyed. Who's going to rebuild it? The United States and NATO, yes, they'll give you a lot of money, but enough money to do this? Debatable at best. So this is your second question you have to deal with. Third question, are you willing to turn Ukraine into a neutral country? And fourthly, like Lenin in the First World War, concessions will need to be made. I think, the eastern part, for better or worse, you'll probably have to hand over, and there'll probably have to be some guarantees for access to those warm water ports for the Russians. Those would be 4 points, aside from exchange of prisoners, retrieval of bodies, this kind of thing, which are normal in every conflict. I would also suggest that not only your professional politicians, but NGOs be included in the negotiations. Because this idea that the interest of the nation is the same as the interest of your leading politicians is crazy. We have the same thing, of course, but I think that kind of critical perspective is important. And you may even want to bring in outside groups. You may even want to bring in outside groups that both sides can more or less agree on.
Do you think Russia will accept such kind of peace settlement?
I don't
Problem
know.
is the problem with that Russia is not going just occupy Ukraine. Russia is going to block the monopolar world. Their goal not Ukraine. Their goal to change the power in the world, to make the new lines of zone of influence in the Europe, on the Middle East, on the Latin America, or something like this. My opinion in this situation, even occupation of Ukraine, if Russia will win, will not lead us to the peace. Maybe, not maybe, straightly not lead us to the peace. Before the Western country will not be ready to take their Russian reasons and ultimatums, or Russia should be defeated in this war, and there will no and she will not be able to make this call to the monopolar, multipolar world. And
there's one other alternative. I'm sorry. There's one other alternative. Russia can win against Ukraine, but it can be so weakened that it can't fight someplace else. That to me is actually the most likely outcome of this. But I could be wrong.
Sorry. It's important. Likely for whom? Is it likely for Western, for the United States? For whom it's likely? It's for you likely.
To do what?
You said that Russia should win this war, but should be so weak.
No. That Russia might win the war, but it's so weakened that it can't fight anywhere else. It wouldn't make sense.
Is it good scenario for United States, for European countries?
Yeah, that would be a great scenario for the United States.
I think so. It's very. I think so. It's very bad for Ukraine.
Very bad for Ukraine. Yeah, it's bad for Ukraine. But you might, under those circumstances, actually get more support for rebuilding the country. I could imagine that. Of course it would. I mean, it involves negotiations, and the negotiations have to begin, as you know, being a diplomat yourself, with back channels. Would Russia accept it? It depends how it's packaged. It depends how Russia, how badly Russia is hurting, because I think it is hurting. And it also depends upon, of course, the tact and clarity of your negotiators. It very much, the way in which the negotiations are organized is really important, and anyway, I think that even if we're not certain that Russia will accept this, You know, the attempt has to be made, not in public, but back channel, through back channel negotiations. And then we can see.
How do you think, what kind of peace settlement United States will accept? Because sometimes,
Good question.
because sometimes during the Minsk negotiation process, it looks like United States trying to disrupt negotiation process and trying to make a different kind of problems during this negotiation process. Not always. Sometimes the United States helps a lot in this process.
Absolutely right.
This policy was quite different in different time. What kind of peace settlement the United States will accept?
Good question. I think to be fair, the kind of peace settlement that would that the United States would accept, aside from just Ukraine winning the war, that would be great, is a situation in which Russia is weakened. The concessions are given by Ukraine, and Ukraine remains a sovereign state with the possibility of rebuilding itself as a kind of, how should we say, buffer against the Soviet, buffer against Russia.
Soviet Russia.
Yes, so to speak. What is the word in Russian? A Voj? Is that right? A boss?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because Russia has always had that, right? Yeah, I think the negotiations would have to speak to concretely the traditional Russian demands, as I said: warm water ports, buffer against Western invasion, neutralization of Ukraine, and sort of the Eastern concessions. I think that's the framework in which you'd be working. That would be my sense.
Yeah, and I know I have a good news for in this situation. Even first 2 or even 3 months of war, there was very weak professional negotiation behind the curtains between the analytical think tanks, between the different types of actors. But nowadays, last month, I see a lot of dialogue in different levels behind the curtains. And we see very prospective process of cutting the sanction and unblocking the Ukrainian seaports on the exporting of the agricultural production of Ukraine.
Right, exactly.
I see situation is changing, and this is, it looks like there is a small window again to talk, to start this talk, because all sides of this conflict starting to understand that the victory in this war is quite impossible, or it's an extremely heavy thing in this
unlikely.
Yeah. And one more question, maybe last even question: how do you think, if Russia will try to grow up the aggression, and if Russia will try to play against the United States interest in the Middle East or Latin America, or Russia will try to grow up the nuclear dangers, what United States will do in this situation?
Well, first of all, you raised something that I forgot, which is the sanctions. Mm-hmm. That is a lever for furthering negotiations. Mm-hmm. In other words, Russia does this, the sanctions go down. Russia doesn't do this, sanctions go up. Mm-hmm. Because nobody, how should I say, everybody is suffering from the sanctions in the West as well as Russia. So that's an important lever. And that would hold for activities not just with Ukraine, but with much of the rest of the world. I know that that Russia is trying to extend its influence in the Middle East, of course, with Syria, and to a degree with Africa. I don't think under these circumstances, I mean, Russia is hurting. It's very hard while a country is under sanctions that are really tight. I mean, one has to say, President Biden did a very good job on this. It's very hard to really extend your influence by yourself as a nation. What I see the danger as I said before, is the creation of this authoritarian axis, because that's possible. China could send and is sending support to Russia. Iran just said it will send support, military and financial, to Russia. And India is doing the same thing. So the base for such an alliance is already there. And that, to me, is what the United States should be worrying about, in my view.
Okay, Stephen, you should add something, because we work in near 1 hour, and I'm apologizing for you for this taking so long time from your.
My pleasure.
You should say something. You should add something. Maybe I didn't ask something.
You mean in closing? In closing, all right. Let me suggest this: that certainly different NGOs outside outside Ukraine, like my own, like the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue, would be very happy to engage those dissidents such as yourself, and try and work together to develop some kind of negotiating strategy. I think this kind of negotiating strategy is crucial, and you need different negotiating strategies for different potential outcomes. You know, it seems to me also that one has to be very flexible in terms of thinking who's going to win this war. The kind of thing where we're going to win or they're going to win, it's not going to happen. And the final thing that I'll say, I guess, is you may not like it. Usually the way negotiations work is like in sports, when people trade players. You say, well, it's a win for one side and it's a win for the other side. So it's a win-win. I don't think that's going to happen here. I think what's going to happen is a lose-lose. In other words, both sides are going to be, how should we say, are not going to be particularly happy, but they don't have to be happy. What they have to do is make peace. And peace is never made with friends. Peace is made with enemies. Those treaties that are important are those that are made with enemies. And that's your task. And we'll help as best we can. We'll
try to do all we can, or best we can, of course. Thank you a lot, Stephen Bronner, doctor, and a big friend of all Ukrainians, a big friend of peace, I think. Thank you a lot, Stephen. Bye-bye.
It's my pleasure, anytime. Bye-bye, and good luck to you and your friends.
Thank you.